Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. As you can tell from the title, today's video is a little different. I've tried to film this video 2 times now and I've scrapped the footage both times. And that's because I'm talking about my overall hip dysplasia story and just going through the actual process of when my hip pain first started, how all this happened, and all my surgeries. And it's a little personal. You know, it's something I've been wanting to share. It's not that I'm like embarrassed of it or anything, but it's just really hard to get on camera and talk about things that personal. But I don't want this video to be a million years long, so I'm just going to jump right into this. But I'm just going to start from when my hip symptoms first started and go to today, which is a lot to explain, so yeah. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I started having a lot of clicking and popping in my hips. And, you know, at first this didn't really like strike me as super weird because I had already had knee problems at this point. You know, I was about 13, 14 at that time. I had developed Osgood Slaughters in my knee when I was like 11 or 12. So I just kind of assumed like, you know, I'm just going to have bad joints. That's just life. And I didn't really think anything of it. I was in karate at this point when this started. I had been training in martial arts for about 4 years, and this popping and this clicking just slowly started getting worse and worse. And I tried to ignore it because I was in the running to test for my black belt. I really wanted to do that because at that point karate was a big part of my life. I had worked really hard to get there, so I just ignored it. I brushed it off as just normal growing pains, and eventually it just got to a point where I couldn't keep up with my karate classes. I couldn't do the kicks correctly. I couldn't stretch and do what I needed to do to participate in martial arts. So I eventually asked my mom to take me to the doctor. So I go to the doctor, and this was not my normal general practitioner, and it kind of makes me a little uncomfortable to talk about because I don't want to bad talk a doctor or anything like that. But this particular doctor, he did not really take me seriously in what I was going through. So he did the x-rays, but he only did prone, like laying, I guess that's the right word, prone. I was laying on my back, and he did one set of x-rays on my hips. And through those x-rays, he said that there was nothing structurally wrong with me, and that how do I say this? He basically asked my mom, or kind of implied to her, that I could have been faking it. Not necessarily faking it, but maybe exaggerating the symptoms, etc. So he diagnosed me with some sort of like muscle tear, tendon, something, I don't even know, without any other testing, and he sent me to physical therapy that was supposed to be for 3 weeks just to strengthen and rehab that muscle. But unfortunately that wasn't the problem, so I continued to get worse. But because I was misdiagnosed with a muscular issue rather than a structural issue, physical therapy made it a lot worse. The exercises you would do to strengthen muscles around your hip actually can injure a joint hip problem. So I eventually just kind of started telling my physical therapist that I felt better because we were going on 2 or 3 months at this point and nothing was really changing, and I just wanted to be out of physical therapy. So after that, I just kind of began to accept physical pain or chronic pain as just my normal, and I just accepted that that's how I was going to feel, and I just had to push through it and continue to exercise and do what I could. Because at this point I had to, you know, drop any sports. You know, I was a big runner, which I still did run for a while after that. But no martial arts, no contact sports, nothing like that. So I just continued on like that until my sophomore year of college, which was last year. And I had just come to this point where I couldn't really do any of the things I love to do anymore. You know, I love to run and lift weights and etc., etc. I love to do all kinds of fun physical stuff. And I could do some of them, but not as well as I normally could. So I was in a lot of pain. I said, Mom, I need to go to the doctor again and find out what's going on. So we went to a local orthopedist where I live, and he looked at my hips and he basically said, yeah, there is something wrong. This is beyond my field of expertise. But this doctor then referred me to Dr. Schrader at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and he's been my surgeon through all 3 of my surgeries. So we go to Dr. Schrader. He takes multiple x-rays this time, not just one, standing up, laying down, different angles, so you can actually see the full extent of the hip socket. And he determined in my right hip, which this was the only painful hip at the time, he determined I had femoral acetabular impingement of the hip. It's a mouthful. I'm just going to call it FAI throughout the video. And essentially what that means is that for some reason or another your hip is injured, and that injury has caused excess bone growth. So in my case, you have the femoral head and the socket, and I had this lump right here of bone, and it would click every time it rotated in my hip, which was the sound I told the doctor was happening. The original doctor, not Dr. Schrader. And so that explained that. In addition to that, I also had a bone spur inside of my hip, and I had a labral tear. And your labrum is this muscle wrapped around your hip, and it holds that hip in place. So all 3 of those things were causing a lot of pain. So we scheduled my surgery. And so even though we didn't know why that injury had happened at this point, I was just relieved to have some sort of answer. And we just figured, maybe it was a genetic thing. We didn't really know. We just kind of took it and we were like, okay, let's get this fixed. And I thought that was going to be the end of that, and it wasn't. So that's a good time. So he scheduled me for arthroscopic surgery, and what they essentially did is they made 3 small incisions about yay big, 2 for tools, 1 for a camera, and the camera guides the surgery. And they take these 2 tools and they shave down the excess bone growth, and then they repaired my labrum by anchoring it to my hip. So it is held together, it's held on my hip by anchors. I think I have 3 of them inside of my hip. So the surgery, it came and it went. It went perfectly well. I went into my physical therapy about a week after surgery, and it went very well. Like, for hip surgery at 19 years old, I was 19 at the time, it was like a best case scenario. I flew through my recovery. I was discharged maybe even a week early, I don't even remember, but I was at least discharged on time. So I went back to running pretty soon, and exercising and doing all the things I had done before, and within a couple months of going back to running, my left hip became very painful, much more painful than the right hip ever was. So that was disheartening. I tried to ignore it for a little bit. As you can see, that's kind of a pattern with me, just ignoring pain and hoping it goes away. It didn't go away. So I tell my surgeon that the left hip is becoming a problem. And this was in probably December of last year. And because I had had so much work done, and I had had so many x-rays throughout the year, they actually couldn't do another one on me for at least a couple months, because you can't be exposed to a certain amount of radiation within a year. It's not healthy. So we waited till about March. I was increasingly in more pain. And we finally do x-rays, and then an MRI, and then a CT scan. And what he finds is that I had hip dysplasia in the left hip. And what that means is when you're in the womb, your hips form in a certain way that's cohesive with movement. It shouldn't be too shallow. You should have a certain amount of coverage over the head of your femur, and that means like your hip socket covers your femur right here. And there are a couple different issues that can happen when it doesn't form correctly. In my case, my hip socket was actually, so say this is the back, it was tilted forward some. And so what would happen is the head of my femur would click out. It would come out and it wouldn't be covered by that socket anymore. So when it would rotate back in, it would click in. Well, I had spent years compensating for this left hip that was never shaped correctly. We didn't know that. And I had been leaning over on the right hip, making my right hip take the brunt of the work all my life. So my right hip became injured, and that's why the right hip hurt first, because the left hip hadn't been doing as much work. So when my right hip was put back in place and put where it was supposed to be, it forced me to walk like a normal human being, and I couldn't do it. So my left hip became very painful. So this was in like February, March of this year when I was diagnosed. I couldn't have surgery till May because I was in college, or still am in college, and I didn't want to miss school for that. So we scheduled it for actually 2 days after my last final in the spring last year. So, you know, it would have been beneficial to have had it earlier. I would have been in a lot less pain because it was super painful. Walking to and from class, going to work, just the act of bending and squatting, I would feel that femur, you know, do its thing and click in and out, in and out. But I did not want to miss school. So I took my last final on May 2nd. I had a day to pack, and then the next day I went in for surgery. Which kind of sucks on a mental and, you know, emotional level, because I really didn't have time to process the surgery and what was really going to happen. I did my research. I knew logically what was going to happen. I didn't really get to prepare for like the emotional side of it. Anyway, so I have the surgery. I'm in the hospital for about, I think I stayed like 4-ish days after that, and it was tough. Like I knew this surgery was going to be harder than the other one, which, let me back up. I didn't even explain what the surgery was. Forgive me. So to correct hip dysplasia, as long as you don't have a certain amount of like cartilage damage or anything like that, you can have what's called a periacetabular osteotomy, or a PAO. And a PAO essentially reconstructs your hip socket so that it is shaped to be more conducive with movement. So what they essentially did is, again, say this is like my hip socket, and it was tilted forward. They cut off a piece right here and they moved it to the back so that my two hip sockets matched. So that's, in a nutshell, what they did. Sounds simple, right? Unfortunately, this surgery is a lot more complicated than an arthroscopic surgery. It's open hip, you know, I have this like 6-inch incision, and there are a lot of other complications that come with this surgery. I think it is important to note that a PAO is not a permanent solution to hip dysplasia. It's what's called a hip preservation surgery. So we're trying to prevent any cartilage damage or osteoarthritis from forming, which would basically, it would make me end up needing a total hip replacement very quickly because of the wear and tear that would happen from my hips not rotating correctly. So it's not a permanent solution, but it is going to offset and put off, hopefully for a very long time, me ever having to have a hip replacement. And I may not ever have to have one. That would be ideal, but I'm not going to be unrealistic about my situation either. You know, it is very likely at this point that I could have one in the future. So anyway, recovery. So for the first 2 weeks, you know, the recovery sucked. It was not pleasant, but it was doable. You know, I was at the pain levels they expected, basically. And I was healing up the way I was supposed to. So I had my 2-week checkup, and they did x-rays. Everything looked like it was supposed to, and I was even starting to have some bone adhering. Like my bones were starting to heal together already, which was, you know, very impressive. And then that same day, I had a very unfortunate accident at my house. I was in the hallway, and my crutch slid out from under me, the crutch supporting my bad side. This is still kind of hard to talk about because it was a very devastating setback. So my crutch slid out from under me. I landed full force on my left leg. I was non-weight bearing at this point, so that was bad. And so a couple days later, you know, I'm increasingly being in more and more pain. And so we go to the doctor, and they take some x-rays, and they found that my hip was in 3 pieces from the surgery, and they found that the pieces had actually separated or shifted down, we assume from the fall. I mean, I would say with like 99% surety that's when it happened. So those pieces slid out of place. So like right here, you could actually see through my hip like that. And so the next day I had to go in for an emergency surgery to put those pieces back in place. So they opened it back up, they re-screwed everything together, and everything has stayed in place this time, so that's good. So it's been an uphill battle from there. You know, I've made a lot of good progress, and I'm really proud of it, because I was on crutches for a very long time because of that setback. I mean, it was easily 2 months or so that I was on crutches. When I finally came off crutches, there was a lot of muscle atrophy. Like, my left thigh and calves were so much smaller than the right leg. So when I finally did come off crutches, I had such an aggressive limp. Like, and being my age, it's almost even more embarrassing to have that because you're young. You're not supposed to look like that. So we battled with muscle atrophy, nerve damage. So let me just show y'all. I'm not literally going to show you, but where my incision is right here, about, yeah, right there. From my incision down to, let me feel, probably like right there. I actually don't have any topical feeling. Like, I sometimes get some nerve firing underneath the surface. And that's because there's this nerve on the top of your thigh that when they go in to do this surgery, they literally have to clamp it to the side. So imagine doing that twice for 2 surgeries. It causes a lot of damage. So as of now, I still don't have any feeling there. I get some nerve misfirings underneath that kind of burn and hurt a lot. But other than that, there hasn't really been any feeling come back. The biggest struggle right now is I still haven't been discharged from physical therapy. I should have been discharged probably last week or so, ideally, anyway. But there are a lot of issues surrounding my muscles and nerves around my hip because my body has compensated for this injured hip for so long that the muscles surrounding it just don't want to engage correctly. And so when we force them to in physical therapy, it becomes very, very painful. And I'm just not where I'm supposed to be right now. I'm supposed to be like back to sport at this point, able to run and lift weights, and I'm nowhere near there. So it's been frustrating. So here's where all this ties into the title. So in the year leading up to my surgery, and even long before that, I had asked God so many times to take my hip pain away. But my parents always raised me to believe that you can ask God for healing and He will heal. We believe that that's not something of the past, that it's not just something that happened in Bible's times. It's something that can happen right now. And so to not see healing in the way I thought it was supposed to be made me question my faith, if I had enough faith, or if I didn't have enough faith and that's why God wasn't healing me, if He was just ignoring me and being a cruel person. There was this big just spiritual battle with that. And despite that, I still do believe that God does that. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen Him heal people. I have verses pulled up over here. It says in 2 Chronicles that if God's people pray and they seek after God, then He will bring healing. So I was like, okay, simple enough. And many of my dear friends and church family and family members have prayed over me because they were like, no, you're gonna be healed and it's gonna be okay. And that healing didn't come. So through all this, I didn't appreciate what God was doing in me. And I didn't realize that He was healing. He just wasn't doing it in the way I wanted. I wanted this quick fix. I wanted it to just go away, to my hip pain to be no more, and not have to go through the surgery and all the tough stuff. Because it's not a fun process. It's not something I wanted to do. But so before surgery, I had really grown away from God. You know, I was mad that I had so much like physical chronic pain. I was mad that I wasn't getting better, and I just didn't feel like talking to Him. Like, I mean, I know that's crazy. I don't feel like building a relationship with the one who made me, but I didn't. And by having such an intense 2 surgeries this summer, I had no choice but to slow down and be with God. I mean, there were so many days where literally all I could do was just sit there or lay there, do my PT, watch some Netflix maybe, and talk to God, you know. And I watched a lot of Netflix, but I also spent a lot more time with God than I had in the recent, year or two. I really made it an effort every day to study my Bible and journal and talk to Him and try to build this more intentional relationship with Him. And it was really such a magical thing to actually like press into God every single day. Like even now with college starting, I've really slacked off on that, and I can tell a difference just in my spirit and in my demeanor and how I interact with others and how I interact with myself and with God. So then in terms of physical health and physical healing, things aren't perfect. My hip is definitely not where I want it to be right now, but it's not in the worst place it could be either. My hip socket is shaped correctly for the first time in my life, and that's amazing. That's a miracle in and of itself, and that's how I realized that God did heal me. He just didn't do it in the way I thought He would. Because I really believe that modern science itself is a miracle. Modern medicine is a miracle. Because even just like 25 years ago, if I had been diagnosed with this, I wouldn't have had any options for surgery. I would have had to wait until the cartilage damage and the osteoarthritis took over and damaged my hip so much that I would get cleared for a total hip replacement. So imagine a 20-something just putting their life on hold until probably they're 30, 35, 40, and they can have a hip replacement, and that's when your life would come back. Like, that's crazy. That's not a quality of life. And so this in and of itself is a total miracle, and I'm so thankful that modern medicine has come to where it is, and I'm so grateful that God has put me in a place, and I live in a place where I can get this, because even in so many other countries, this treatment just isn't available. So I'm so blessed in that. So even in the past week or two, even, I've just been very ungrateful, and I've been very angry, and I hate that for myself because I don't want to be bitter and be holding that inside of me. I've just been angry because I feel like I'm in just as much pain as I was before surgery. I'm mad that I can't feel some of my leg. I'm mad that the muscles around my hip aren't engaging the way they're supposed to. My body's not doing what it's supposed to do, and most of all, I was just mad that things didn't go the way I thought they would. This is not how I wanted to start my 20s off. This is not where I want my life to be right now. And I stopped being appreciative of the fact that my hip socket is where it's supposed to be. My hip's going to be preserved for hopefully a very long time, and I may not even have to have a hip replacement. Like, that's a miracle, and I'm so grateful for that. So I really hope this whole message can help you wherever you're at today. If you're in a place where you just don't understand what God's doing or why He's put your life on hold, I feel like we all kind of get into these seasons of life where it seems like nothing's happening the way you want it to, and you're wanting to just like push forward, and God's pulling the reins back. I just encourage you to just trust the process and trust that every step of your story is intentional. Everything that happens for a reason. I know it's a cliche, but it's true. God doesn't do things haphazardly. So I love this verse from, I have it pulled up over here, sorry, I keep looking over there. It's from Ecclesiastes 3, and this just brought so much peace to my heart. It says, "For everything there is a season, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted." And I really think of these like holding periods, these times of life where you're not moving where you want to be, as the planting period. And what you choose to plant has a huge effect on the outcome. So you think of like planting seeds outside. It's super boring. Like it's very monotonous work. It's laborious. You're in the sun. You're in the heat. It might be painful. Your back's tired. The whole shazam. It's boring. It sucks. You don't want to do it. But if you don't do the hard labor, you're not going to reap any harvest later on. So in every like planting season, you have a choice of what you plant. You can let those seeds of like bitterness and anger and resentment plant and grow, or you can choose God and you can choose His truth and let that grow in your heart. And so when you come out of that like quote unquote planting season, I can promise you that you're never going to regret choosing joy and gratefulness over anger and bitterness, because anger and bitterness is never going to produce any good fruit. So that about sums up the whole ordeal. I'm sure I've missed a couple things here and there. I'm always open to talk about this whole thing and what it's been like. So if you have any questions that I didn't go over, message me on Instagram, comment it down below, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions about, hip dysplasia or invisible disabilities, etc., or about God. Who knows? Ask away. But I love you all so much. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below and share this with your friends and family. I appreciate you all, and I hope to see you in next week's video. Bye.